March 23rd, 1918. We are going like hell, on and on, day and night. The sun and moon help. 1 or 2 hours halt, then on again. Our baggage is somewhere in the rear, and nobody expects to see it again. We are glad if ration carts and field kitchens can get up to us at night. Then men and horses feed for the next 24 hours at one sitting. Today this happened at 7 a.m. Then the ration carts disappear again until further notice. We have reached the zone in which all the wells and streams have been wrecked, and the water for the attacking troops has to be brought up in water carts. That applies to men. The horses have got to wait until we cross the canal at Moylan-Nurlu. We are supposed to reach it today. Spent the night on the bare floor of an English dugout with the GOC artillery and his officers. Now we go forward, past craters and trenches, captured gun positions, ration dumps and clothing depots. Another wonderful spring day with an early mist, which helps us. Our cars now run on the best English rubber tyres. We smoke none but English cigarettes, and plaster our boots with lovely English boot polish, all unheard of things which belong to a fairyland of long ago. There are limits to personal cleanliness. Comfort consists in a horse bucket full of very doubtful water out of a shell hole, but one treats it as if it came straight from the springs of Baden-Baden. So glad is one's skin to be refreshed. We assume that it will be at least 8 days before we are under a roof again. The devastation is immeasurable. There is hardly a cellar left of the villages which we destroyed, and over which the unexpected attack now rages. Of course, the really hard part will begin when we get on beyond. Craterfield, near La Forest, March 26, 1918. There was the corner of a little wood where the English put up a desperate resistance, apparently with a few machine guns, and finally with only one. When the defence was broken down, out from the lines of our advancing infantry, which I was following, appeared an English general, accompanied by a single officer. He was an extraordinary sight, about 35 years old, excellently, one can almost say wonderfully dressed and equipped. He looked as if he had just stepped out of a Turkish bath in Jermyn Street. Brushed and shaved, with his short khaki overcoat on his arm, in breeches of the best cut and magnificent high lace boots, such as only the English bootmakers make to order, he came to meet me easily and without the slightest embarrassment. The sight of all this English cloth and leather made me more conscious than ever of the shortcomings of my own outfit, and I felt an inward temptation to call out to him, "Kindly undress at once," for a desire for an English general's equipment with tunic, breeches and boots had arisen in me, shameless and patent. I said good morning, and he came to a stop with his companion. By way of being polite, I said with intention, "You have given us a lot of trouble. You stuck with it for a long time." To which he replied, "Trouble? Why, we have been running for 5 days and 5 nights." It appeared that when he could no longer get his brigade to stand, he had taken charge of a machine gun himself, to set an example to his retreating men. All his officers except the one with him had been killed or wounded, and his brigade hopelessly cut up. I asked for his name, to remind me of our meeting, and he gave it. He was General Dawson, an equerry of the king. We have now spent 2 nights in the craterfield of the old Somme battle. No desert of salt is more desolate. Last night we slept in a hole in the crumbly, chalky soil, and froze properly. It is impossible to sleep for excitement. Really, one would like to be after them day and night, and only longs that there shall be no rest until one can feel the first breath of the Atlantic in Amiens. Tomorrow we hope to be on a level with Albert, where there will be villages again. Here the villages are merely names. Even the ruins are ruined. Yesterday I was looking for Bouchaven, which used to be quite a large place. There was nothing but a board nailed to a low post with the inscription in English, "This was Bouchaven." Meaux, to the south of Albert, March 27th, 1918. We are through at last, through the awful craterfield of the Somme. After 25 miles of unbroken waste, the first house, ruined though it was saluted like a vision from the promised land. Our troops passed to the south of Albert. Now we are already in the English back areas, or at least rest areas, a land flowing with milk and honey. Marvellous people, who will only equip themselves with the very best that the earth produces. Our men are hardly to be distinguished from English soldiers. Everyone wears at least a leather jacket, waterproof shorts, or long English boots, or some other beautiful thing. The horses are feasting on masses of oats and gorgeous food cakes. The inhabitants deliver up chickens and pigeons with the usual tears. Cows, calves, and pigs find their way unobtrusively out of their farmyards into the field kitchens, and there is no doubt the army is looting with some zest. Yesterday evening we witnessed the wonderful spectacle of the English blowing up all the ammunition dumps in this area, and there were not a few. Millions of shells will have no further chance of being fired at us. If we had not had this weather, we would not be nearly as far as we are. To push the enemy through 25 miles of desert at the most unlikely spot of all, with horse, foot, and artillery, rations, and ammunition, that was a conception worthy of a leader. Fighting by day, movement without stopping by night of troops and transport along 10 roads simultaneously. Like the wandering of a people, like a sea of tailless serpents moving their heads all level before them, so was this advance. Today I was mildly hit, so mildly that it only raised a wheal. A rifle bullet went through 2 coats which I was wearing in the early morning on account of the cold, and struck my thigh like a blow from a hammer. I was wearing a pair of riding breeches of English cloth, against which the English bullet stopped respectfully and fell to earth. I picked it up almost like a friendly greeting, and stuck it in the pocket of the breeches which it had failed to pierce. March 28, 1918. Everything is still a tremendous strain for us all. For 8 days we have not been able to take off our clothes and boots. Often there is no water even for washing, let alone drinking. All that is available is the icy cold water of the shell holes, quite clear above the green scum at the bottom. We first take a mouthful each to drink, and then use it successively for cleaning our teeth, then for moistening our shaving brushes, and finally for washing. Same date. Today the advance of our infantry suddenly stopped near Albert. Nobody could understand why. Our airmen had reported no enemy between Albert and Amiens. The enemy's guns were only firing now and again on the very edge of affairs. Our way seemed entirely clear. I jumped into a car with orders to find out what was causing the stoppage in front. Our division was right in front of the advance, and could not possibly be tired out. It was quite fresh. When I asked the brigade commander on the far side of Meaux why there was no movement forward, he shrugged his shoulders and said he did not know either. For some reason the divisions which had been pushed on through Albert on our right flank were not advancing, and he supposed that this was what had caused the check. I turned round at once and took a sharp turn with the car into Albert. As soon as I got near the town, I began to see curious sights. Strange figures, which looked very little like soldiers and certainly showed no sign of advancing, were making their way back out of the town. There were men driving cows before them on a line, others who carried a hen under one arm and a box of notepaper under the other, men carrying a bottle of wine under their arm and another one open in their hand, men who had torn a silk drawing-room curtain from off its rod and were dragging it to the rear as a useful bit of loot. More men with writing paper and coloured notebooks. Evidently they had found it desirable to sack a stationer's shop. Men dressed up in comic disguise, men with top hats on their heads, men staggering, men who could hardly walk. They were mostly troops from one of the marine divisions. When I got into the town, the streets were running with wine. Out of a cellar came a lieutenant of the 2nd Marine Division, helpless and in despair. I asked him, "What is going to happen?" It was essential for them to get forward immediately. He replied solemnly and emphatically, "I cannot get my men out of this cellar without bloodshed." When I insisted, assuming from my white dragoon facings that I belonged to the same division as himself, he invited me to try my hand, but it was no business of mine, and I saw too that I could have done no more than he. I drove back to Divisional HQ with a fearful impression of the situation. The advance was held up, and there was no means of setting it going again for hours. When I considered what was happening up front, it seemed to me to be merely a magnified expression of the passion and craving which we were all experiencing. Had I not seen yesterday an officer younger than myself sitting beside me in the car, suddenly called out to the driver to stop at once, without so much as asking my leave? When I asked him in astonishment what he meant by stopping the car when we were on an urgent mission, He answered, "I must just pick up that English waterproof lying beside the road." The car stopped. He jumped out, seized an English waterproof which lay on the bank, and then jumped joyfully back again, as if refreshed and waked to new life. If this lack of restraint seized an officer like that, one can imagine what effect it must have had on the private soldier to have craved and hungered and thirst for months on end. Where in the case of the officer it was the waterproof which tempted him so irresistibly as to make him forget his most important duties. With the private soldiers, according to taste, it was the coloured picture postcard, the silk curtain, the bottle of wine, the chicken, or the cow. But in most cases the wine. English artillery repair shops near Proyart, on the high road to Amiens, March 29th, 1918. We are searching for the weakest spot. As yesterday, the advance was stopped at Albert, while the 18th Army to our left thrust forward as far as Montdidier. Our division is being withdrawn today behind the left wing of the Second Army, which is to push on past Amiens, some 6 miles to the south. We are quartered in the huts of an enormous camp which was partly artillery workshops, partly dump for 1,000 different things, and partly prisoners' camp. There are new guns of the latest type, masses of gun parts, valuable brass fittings, cables, electromotors, axles, wheels, gun carriages, and everything you can think of, standing about in such colossal quantities that one runs amazed and staring from one to the other, just as if it were an exhibition. Under normal conditions, wealth does not attract such attention, but when even the rottenest hut has brass hinges and latches, when every electric light switch is entirely composed of brass, when one sees depots of thousands of pairs of rubber trench boots, piles of rubber tyres, a pyramid of iron nails of every sort, when one sees bathhouses with enormous rubber baths and so on, then one realises the difference between poverty and privations and wealth. I got an impression that the English made everything either out of rubber or brass, because these were the two materials which we had not seen for the longest time. At every crossroads there are little towers of machine-gun ammunition which anyone can reach. Anybody who needs ammunition can take a box. Why not? Who would steal or carry off machine-gun ammunition, or take it for himself if others needed it? Although lots of material has fallen into our hands, there seems nevertheless to have been time to get the most valuable away. Only the enormous plenty which was there makes the residue still seem unnaturally great. From a point in the neighbourhood one can see Amiens Cathedral. The fighting has been awful. In the church at Rancourt, English and Germans are still lying locked in death. The number of dead horses which have still not been cleared away surpassed all imagination and gives some idea of the loss in human lives. I only hope victory will not drive us to death. The difficulties of reinforcement are now beginning. Our former camp for details is 50 to 60 miles behind us, and the new camp has not yet been chosen. Beaucourt Château, near Moret, March 31st, 1918. Piety and neglect. Holy water from Lourdes, relics, and thousands of little pictures of Christ were what these people like better than cleanliness and comfort. Sanitary appliances were apparently not sufficiently holy to be favoured, for there is nothing that resembles them in the whole chateau. Presumably Mademoiselle de Riencourt, who kept a collection of confession tickets from Paris in her chest of drawers as proof of her piety, was in the habit of taking a daily walk in the park. After that she used to have a lesson from the Abbé de Cormont. She kept a notebook on the subject in which is written inter alia, L'eau bénite, ses effets, L'eau bénite chasse les démons, soulage les malades, attire la grâce de Dieu, remet et efface les péchés véniels. Les chrétiens des premiers siècles faisaient un fréquent usage de l'eau bénite. Nous devons recourir aussi fréquemment à ce sacramental puisqu'il nous offre de si précieux avantages, etc. All this water has been collected from many different places and stands in little bottles. Unfortunately, it is of no good to us, and the précieux avantages, even where they do become felt, will not be for the likes of us. Beaucourt, March 31st, 1918. The atmosphere of neglect of this French chateau can be felt and smelt like an odour, even through the terrible filth and mess which has been spread through it, owing to the successive use of the building by French, English, and finally German HQ French and English officers' names, still stand under my own on the door of the room where I sleep at night on a bare mattress, and we all share one kitchen. One can hardly move in the hall for dead and wounded. The steps are littered with straw and hay, left by the soldiers who have carried it up to the attics to make beds for themselves there. The French guns are sending their shells whistling flat over the roof, but they still go too high. Most of them land as duds in the mud of the park, where horses and wagons stand in the wet. Endless columns of transport move backwards and forwards. Men, dispatch riders, cars, guns and stretchers appear inextricably mixed up together, but in the end most of them find their right place. The cookers reach their companies, the ammunition gets to the batteries, the wounded are brought to the dressing station, though maybe they are dead by the time they get attended to. The horses are having a good time. There is oats and hay in abundance everywhere. But for that, the bivouacs would be fatal on these cold nights. There is no help for the wounded horses. Hundreds of horse trains would be needed, and this would burden the lines of communication more than would be justified. The result is that one sees hundreds of dead horses about, dumb reproaches to human folly, whereas dead men, once buried, make no complaints. Undoubtedly, if the statesmen and politicians of all countries, who count for anything and have any word in affairs, could have taken part in this progress through the desert, and stopped here for a while in this most recent devastation, if they could bear the privations in the dirt and blood, and have to sit tight under constant fire from in front and above, none of them would be against peace. Any peace would be good enough for them. But as it is, they sit at their conference tables and regard it almost as a scandal that the armies cannot succeed in advancing on all the fronts together. We have now got French troops in front of us as well as English. One can tell that from the systematic direction of the artillery and the bombardment of vital points behind the line. The English never do that. Our divisions are much thinner, but the enemy must have had unusually heavy losses. Captured English officers complain bitterly of the complete failure of their staff work. They say, moreover, that in spite of their recommendations that the troops should be trained for open warfare, their GHQ refused to do so on the ground that it was unnecessary. They represent the confusion as something awful, and it is true that we have intercepted wireless messages in which the GHQ asks whither it is to send reinforcements. Meanwhile, our own divisions are out of breath for the time being, and the troops are looting into the bargain as they suddenly become aware of their long privations. April 2nd, 1918. One cannot go on victoriously forever without ammunition or any sort of reinforcements. Behind us lies the wilderness. It is true that the railway is running again as far as Péronne, but it has too many demands to meet. The above-mentioned confession certificates of Mademoiselle Marie de Riencourt meet one in every drawer, like some distinctive and ever-recurring odour. This Miss Nothing Court kept regular accounts as regards her soul. Presumably she hopes one day to present these receipts to her God, in case the accounts in his books do not tally. I have an idea that she entertains some doubts about the accuracy of the Almighty's bookkeeping and business management. The thing which annoys and upsets us here again and again are the exaggerations of the newspapers and the telegrams to crowned heads about the decisive victory, and the words, the same old words. The same may be said of the premature decorations. Nobody grudges Hindenburg the Blucher Cross, but the proper occasion on which to confer it would have been after the capture of Amiens. The Crown Prince becomes colonel of a famous regiment, and in this connection the hope is expressed that the regiment will at all times prove itself worthy of its exalted commander. It does not appear to be recognized that the appointment imposes a corresponding obligation on him. Beaucourt, April 4th, 1918. The hardships are very great. One does not think about them because it is natural that they should exist and that they should be insignificant compared with the greatness of the issue. If indeed wars are to be considered great things, the private who lies day and night in the mud in the open, waiting for a shell or an air bomb to blow him to bits, is worse off than I am, but I can only speak for myself. Imagine a series of stinking rooms which yesterday or the day before were a chateau. The wind and rain come in at the windows, in which fragments of glass tinkle at every shell burst. The walls tremble all day and all night. When the heavy shells are seeking out their mark by degrees and draw nearer, the men run to the cellar. There is no room there for us officers, and we go on working. Stretcher cases get smothered there in the darkness of the night by others who are trying to get shelter. The place stinks of blood, sweat, urine, excrement, iodoform, and wet clothes. Down below in the passages they peel potatoes, but nobody thinks of throwing away the peel. One puts down the wounded on top of it. The house rings day and night with cries of pain, but with craven and selfish demands as well. The numbers of dead on the lawn of the park steadily increase, while the scum of the army stand round and stare at them with revolting curiosity. In the corner there is a man digging graves without ceasing. A single shell lays out 10 horses at once under the trees. They are not removed. They would be just as much in the way anywhere else. No sooner have 30 wounded been evacuated than there are 50 more in their place. The hospital in the church has had 631 entries in one day, and there is one surgeon. Of course, there are other hospitals just as full. All rations and ammunition have to be brought up from Péronne, 20 miles away. All wounded, damaged guns and transport trains have to be sent back there or even farther. We have had no fresh meat for a week. Only 1 or 2 chickens serve to supply the illusion that chicken broth was invented to stay one's hunger on in wartime. The wells have been exhausted or defiled through the carelessness of the men. 1 or 2 sheep and cattle, which might have been of some use had they been properly slaughtered, get butchered anyhow as if there were thousands of them. It is impossible to keep a room or any sort of shelter or bed place clean, because there is no water, no brooms, nor even the most primitive utensil available. Chairs and cupboards are broken up to light fires. We have no other fuel, and when this is used up, there is nothing left. By the light of a guttering tallow candle, 2 officers are writing reports and orders which will settle the fate of thousands of others, possibly our own. My bed is as hard as a board. When I get up from it, I feel more of a wreck than when I lay down, but by changing my position, I try to pretend that I am getting rest. Our division has not struck it lucky. It is ours which has had the heavy fighting on the heights to the north of Moreuil, which are mentioned in the reports. We can make no progress here. Even the fresh divisions do no better. The slippery ground is against us. For every step forward one slides back 2, and the ground rises all the way. I suppose the march and the fighting through the devastated zone were really hard work, but we were fresher then, and we had a retreating enemy in front of us. I can still find no word nor image to express the awfulness of that waste. There is nothing like it on earth, nor can be. A desert is always a desert, but a desert which tells you all the time that it used not to be a desert is appalling. That is the tale which is told by the dumb, black stumps of the shattered trees, which still stick up where there used to be villages. They were completely flayed by the splinters of the bursting shells, and they stood there like corpses upright. Not a blade of green anywhere round. The layer of soil which once covered the loose chalk is now buried underneath it. Thousands of shells have brought the stones to the surface and smothered the earth with its own entrails. There are miles upon miles of flat, empty, broken and tumbled stone quarry, utterly purposeless and useless, in the middle of which stand groups of these blackened stumps of dead trees, poisoned oases, killed forever. This area ought to remain as it is. No road, no well, no settlement ought to be made there, and every ruler, leading statesman, or president of a republic ought to be brought to see it, instead of swearing an oath on the Constitution, henceforth and forever. Then there would be no more wars. Beaucourt Château, April 9th, 1918. Last night the shells set the chateau on fire. There was a fearful to-do. In the dark rooms of the ground floor, people stumbled over the wounded and the dead without distinction. There were yells of pain from those who were trampled on, and yells of fear from those who thought they were going to be. Everything that had legs ran some way out into the park. It proved possible to put the fire out, so 2 hours later the rooms were occupied again in a worse state of disorder and ruin than ever. The weather is ghastly. Otherwise the glare of the burning chateau would have given the enemy a splendid target. Man and beast now wallow in the mud day and night. Perhaps the mud at least holds some warmth. There was a time when we laughed at Cadorna, the Italian commander-in-chief, because he reported that his offensive was held up by bad weather. Now it is the case with us. Machine guns which are buried in mud every time a shell bursts near them cannot shoot. Men whose feet are clogged in it cannot charge. Tomorrow we leave the Riencourt Chateau for quieter quarters. Our losses are too heavy. The total fighting strength of our 3 infantry regiments is at the moment about 600, and some of our batteries are incapable of movement. English hutments at Agincourt-le-Basse, April 12, 1918. Found my trunk again, which is an unheard-of treat. After cleaning myself by stages in the big blue salad bowl, I realized that so far as my memory goes, I have not had a complete wash for 25 days. I am wearing low boots for a change, and feel passably indifferent to my long-suffering riding boots. We are to spend some time here. The camp lies in the middle of the wilderness, which we crossed in our advance. If the weather remains as bad as it threatens to do, it will be a dreary spell. For the moment there are some deceptive rays of sun, and there is a touch of spring in the air. A woebegone apple tree is even trying to blossom beside my hut in spite of the ruins, but it looks as if it did not know why it was blossoming. April 16th, 1918. These English corrugated iron huts make horrible quarters. A low roof of corrugated iron, rounded like a tunnel, rests right on the ground, and is closed at either end by thin scantling, in which there is a door on one side and a window on the other. Ours smells of the bad cigars which 2 of our officers cannot forego, and of the soot and smoke which an iron stove adds to the reek. In the cold of the early morning, the tin cools off to below the inside temperature. This produces a disgusting damp chill, which makes us feel for hours as if we were in an ice machine, until the servants come and light the fire again with some sort of stinking coal dust. Agincourt-le-Basse, April 19th, 1918. It is practically certain that the reason why we did not reach Amiens was the looting at Albert and Moreuil. The same thing happened in both places. In Albert I saw it myself. The 2 places, which were captured fairly easily, contained so much wine that the divisions, which ought properly to have marched through them, lay about unfit to fight in the rooms and cellars. This was quite unforeseen. No other troops had been ordered to follow up, with the result that the enemy gained fresh footing. The halt gave just time for French artillery to be brought up from the south. The imprudence, together with hunger, thirst, and the general sense of years of privation, were simply too great and too overpowering. The disorder of the troops at these 2 places, which has been fully attested by German officers, must have cost us a good 50,000 men, apart from the lost opportunity. For the troops which moved out of Albert next day cheered with wine, and in victorious spirits, were mown down straight away on the railway embankment by a few English machine guns, while those who escaped were laid out by French artillery in their next attack. The evacuation of the Ypres salient, which is now to be forced to make up for it, is nothing compared with the loss of Amiens. We were within a hair's breadth of getting there. We have found French army orders which foresaw the complete separation of the British army from the French, and contained provision in case touch with the British troops is still maintained. The madness, stupidity, and indiscipline of the German soldier is shown in other things as well. They destroy everything useful, even absolute necessities, and first and foremost things which serve for the common good. This is enough to make anyone meditate. Whereas the common good is the phrase which they profess to know best, the appalling fact remains that any huts, houses, tents, or similarly useful objects which have once been used by German troops are done for. The English had been forced to abandon completely untouched a magnificent waterworks at Templeux-la-Fosse, with a system of pipes as thick as your arm. As I passed by the spot during the advance in the rear of the fighting line, the reservoir was full, the motor was intact, and clean water squirted from all the brass taps. A few days ago, after the division had been withdrawn from the line, I passed Templeux-la-Fosse again on our way back through the wilderness, and looked forward to reaching this oasis. This time the reservoir tank was overturned, the motor had been stolen, the brass taps had all been screwed off, or knocked off, or torn off, and all the villages round about, all our quarters, were without water. In every hut some fist has been deliberately thrust through each window, and even though they are only made of oiled paper, they cannot be replaced for the time. Any useless toy or trifle they seize and load into their packs. Anything useful which they cannot carry away they destroy. In face of this conduct, one is inclined to believe that only flogging will help, but our weak social conscience considers the hide of these conscienceless fellows so important that it may not even be tanned. Aïssa-Court-le-Bar, April 22nd, 1918. All the hardships of the offensive have not worn me out so much as these weeks of nominal rest. The cramped and dirty quarters in the middle of this wilderness, the constant company of two men, one of whom is so naive that he cannot realize that one needs one's own thoughts to keep alive, the insomnia from which I have suffered ever since I arrived here, and the conviction that no one, not even the others, can really return to the normal in this state of internal and external derangement. All this produces in me a load of nervousness which I am unable to stifle. Moreover, the weather remains bleak, stormy, and unfriendly. The sunny land of France is evidently an invention of some irritated Englishman. The news both from the front and the rear is equally scarce. The one certainty is that we are not advancing, while the threat of an American army gathers like a thundercloud in the rear of our other enemies. Of course, the feeling of superiority which our troops have felt since March 21st is worth an army in itself. All the same, victory lies only with fresh troops, who are really rested and who are fortified by fresh underwear, good boots, clean rifles, overhauled guns, and properly rested officers. The physical exhaustion of the infantry during the period from April 4th to 10th, not until the end of which was a cessation of the fighting considered necessary here at the front, was so great that finally the men could hardly fire their rifles. They let themselves be slowly wiped out by the enemy's artillery fire almost without caring, and would hardly move from the spot. They were just like used-up horses which stand fast in the shafts and dumbly take the blows of the whip without a movement. They could not advance, they could not shoot, they could not even get out of the way of the fire. They just stuck there. Probably it was the same with the enemy, but when two opposing forces are entirely exhausted, it is a matter of indifference whether the generalship on one side is abler than on the other. They are equally ineffective. Both weapons are equally blunt. April 27th, 1918. Orders to move to the front. For the staff, the change means practically nothing. Our new quarters, like the old, will be in English huts. Corrugated iron is the same everywhere. Also the discomfort. Only the visits from enemy airmen will be more frequent, and we shall come in for the heavy artillery fire. Our third passage through the wilderness, which I have now described more than once, only increases its effect of dreariness. It makes one shake one's head. This sort of wilderness remains incomprehensible. Everything still remains unchanged. Most of the dead horses have had their skins removed, but they decay where they lie. Innumerable tanks stand about like broken-down elephants. Only the dead men have been buried. But it will be months before the area can be completely cleared up, and it will be weeks before we get our reinforcements regularly. English hutment camp above the Somme Valley, May 3rd, 1918. Been for a ride through the Somme Valley, half for pleasure and half for reconnaissance. This is a cheerful river, fast and clear. Every now and then it divides into branches, or opens out into a broad, irregular bed in which the chalk gleams white. A number of prettily sited villages make the valley attractive, but as soon as one comes out onto the bare chalk downs, one meets the dreariness of the great barren stretches of shell-ploughed country once again. The ground is as hard as iron. Weedy grass, weedy elms and osiers, standing in little irregular patches, give the country a particular character which resembles nothing which we have at home. The English have not touched the country. One or two fields are ploughed, but the greater part lie fallow. The innumerable hutment camps prove that they neither sought nor found any quarters for their troops in the villages. In spite of evident attempts at order and cleanliness, these camps are not free from dirt, and lice seem to be as much at home with the Briton as with the Frenchman. One comes to dislike French ways more than ever. I have preserved a report from the Matin of April 23rd, 1918, on the death of Richthofen. In order to do him a hypocritical justice, it drags him into the mud. There is nothing extraordinary in the fact that they defend their country bravely, to the extent of sacrificing their sons. Even the bees do that if one robs their hive. It is difficult to say which behaves more despicably, the nation or the government, the press or the professors, the men or the women. I have recently seen a set of pictures, supposed to be original photographs and representing German atrocities. They were a series of crude representations of mutilations, executions of innocent people, old men and invalids, the hanging of priests in churches, the burning of babies in straw, the robing of churchyards, etc. It would be impossible for anything of the sort to be produced in Germany or England, in Sweden or Denmark. In any case, it would not be allowed to circulate. In France, one buys it on the boulevards, and the country is no more ashamed of its production than a pig is of his manure. This is the way in which the Mating of April 23, 1918, informs its readers of the death of Richthofen. Death of a famous German airman, Freiherr von Richthofen, commander of the squadron of the Red Pirates, has been shot down in the neighbourhood of Amiens. April 22nd. The famous German airman, the elder Richthofen, has been shot down near Amiens. How, it is not yet known. This will be a deadly blow to German pride. In it we see just retribution. Squadron number 11, the squadron of the Red Pirates, which the titled cavalry captain commanded, did not belong to that sort of German airmen which goes out like barbarians at night to murder women and children. On the contrary, his deeds gave proof of a certain noblesse and some inkling of gentlemanly feeling. Only the conspicuously gaudy colours of his planes, which were painted blood-red with a somewhat childish idea of frightening his opponents, betrayed his barbaric tastes and the height of his ambition. At the very moment when our men were picking up the bloody remains of the titled captain, the German wireless was publishing with gross satisfaction the news of his 79th and 80th victories. And today he will be buried. To the accompaniment of a salvo of German shells, his body will be laid in the cemetery at Amiens, in the soil of our gasping, undelivered France. Richthofen, the first cavalry captain Freiherr von Richthofen, made his appearance in the arena of air fighting soon after the death of Bolker, who was formerly the first among the famous German airmen. Bolker was killed at the end of October 1916. On January 24, 1917, the German communiqué suddenly reported the 17th victory of Freiherr von Richthofen, whose title gave a certain distinction to his squadron, which was almost exclusively composed of commoners. He quickly passed from one honour to another. His victories were on everybody's lips. During the last year of Richthofen, I commanded the famous Tango Squadron, which was constantly at war with our squadron of cigognes. Cavalry Captain Freiherr von Richthofen never worked alone. No doubt he deserves praise, but he owes his reputation entirely to the tactics of his squadron, which were to fall together upon one or two Allied aeroplanes. In a duel with a Guynemer, a Ball, a Fonck, or a McCuddle, Richthofen would certainly have been beaten. The number of his victories was deliberately exaggerated, either with the object of increasing the popularity of the Air Force in Germany, or of impressing the neutrals with the idea that the Boche air chasers were superior to those of the Entente. A number of the machines shot down by his unit were attributed to Richthofen. At times, every plane brought down by the Richthofen group, which comprised about 50 pilots, was written down in the usual German manner to the account of the titled cavalry captain. Accordingly, it is not to be wondered at that, when he was wounded last December, he already counted 61 air victories. Lieutenant Hans Müller, to whom 38 victories are ascribed, will be Richthofen's successor. It is hardly likely that the Boches will be satisfied with such a small number. We shall see that, according to custom, they will give him the benefit of other people's successes. Translation certified correct. Von Songten, Captain and Intelligence Officer, General Headquarters, May 5, 1918. I am going home for a fortnight. I am suffering from an unaccountable irritation of the nerves of the skin, which is very troublesome. Tiny blisters appear, now here, now there, at the nervous extremities. They cause considerable pain and call for better surroundings, baths and cleanliness. Condy, June 1, 1918. I find my quarters in a little old-fashioned town, the old walls and gates of which enclose a certain degree of recently acquired wealth. Both we and the men have clean billets. We are surrounded by well-tended gardens and the densely shaded little promenades in and around the town moat. Magnificent stables, extravagantly equipped, give proof of a certain degree of tranquility. The little town knows nothing of the war. Before I arrived, an official social intercourse had already been established with the hospital sisters, who unfortunately are not distinguished for their beauty. A certain amount of humour is displayed on both sides. It was apparently opened by a duet between the elderly Mother Superior on one side and our little Excellency on the other, and excites the junior lieutenants to ecstasy and twilight promenades. Men and horses are gradually getting into better shape, or one pretends so. It may be true of the men. The horses look like caged rabbits, soft and no good for work, though the grooms love that sort of thing. Conde, June 14th, 1918. Our period of rest is nearly over. The preparations are not so elaborate and energetic as they were before the spring offensive of this year. It cannot be done. I am still short of 500 horses if the guns and transport are to have anything like full teams, and those which I have got do not get over-treated with the little sharp yellow grain which ought to be their real food. All the same, there are signs that the division is again to be used for a big undertaking. It is impossible to feel as much confidence as at the beginning of the P-year. There will certainly be no surprise. Spies, agents and deserters are giving the enemy more information than ever. It is true that agents reported our plan in the spring, but over yonder they did not believe it. Now, after the most unlikely things have proved to be true, they will credit us with anything. Grateful though we are for the clean billets here, nobody seriously regrets leaving. The little old fortress, with its face to Belgium, is all very charming as a place to rest in, but the life is too petty, literally walled up in a corner untouched by the war. A live man cannot stand that. The staff officers spooned freely with the sisters of the war hospital, but I did not find them either pretty or amusing enough. They all seemed to have fairly good grounds for having joined a sisterhood. They read nothing but trash, and quoted Wilhelm Tell on every occasion to show their education and to destroy the illusion that they were mere girls. They did this so ostentatiously that they succeeded in losing even this good quality. We learned all this on one occasion, when they were hungry, and we invited them to dinner, for naturally some of them wanted to put their hunger to good use. But after a polite pretense at conversation on an educated basis, the enthusiasm on our side waned. I like simple girls if they will remain simple girls, but when they quote Tell and indulge in educated conversation, the charm goes. When I am riding alone in the early morning, or lying awake in the light summer night and find everything wonderful, I realize deep down in me the change which the war alone can have brought about. The fact that it makes so much seem ridiculous and useless, that it has brought us hardships and the power to endure them, that it makes so much seem small, and that it justifies its existence, even as a most frightful monster, will change us all. That is what I hope for. June 16th, 1918. We are getting rid of a watery Protestant divisional padre, who goes to be chaplain to the army. I would not record this fact if it were not symptomatic. Stupidity is a qualification for office. That appears to be fixed as an axiom for the future. In the present case, we may be thankful for it. Now I am applying to be the senior Protestant chaplain for that splendid fellow Nicolason for our division. He is the man about whom I wrote such good things when he came to see me about his dead son. I have inquired about him amongst the troops, for it is no good giving the sheep a shepherd against their will. But they all like him, particularly because he goes up into the front line with the stretcher-bearers to look after the wounded. That counts a lot with them. That does not prevent our former padre, whom now, with God's help, we are getting rid of, from spending every minute of his time running round to emphasize the fact that he has not yet got the Iron Cross. Other divisional padres, so he says, have already got it. Sometimes one wishes one were a bootblack. June 19th, 1918. There are some curious situations. The division is crying out for horses and needs them badly. Army HQ is shirking its obligation to provide us with animals, and shoving it off onto other formations to which the division is to be attached. At the same time, it counts on making a good raid on the horses sent back to its veterinary hospital on account of sores, by sticking to them when they are well. This means one has to be as sharp with them as if they were horse copers. Sometimes it is quite amusing. I have had the good luck to wangle 300 horses out of these Army HQ, though they still owe me 200. As the Army needs men just as I need horses, I have got something valuable to bargain with which I can use with a clear conscience. The men in question are those who, in accordance with a decree of the Ministry of War, may not be used in the front line. These blood sacrifices, as they significantly call themselves, although others are the sacrifice and they are spared, are not on any account to be brought under fire, not even to be allowed near it in charge of a cooker. I am a blood sacrifice, they tell you, when you ask why they are hanging back. These are the folk whom I now trade for horses. By an exchange of values which is awful enough to consider, I get 3 good beasts for every man. Charleville, June 27, 1918. The war is not, after all, in such a hurry with us as it seemed from our sudden departure from the little back-area fortress and its innocence. Our journey lasted half a day and a whole night, but did not take us far. Wanton and adventurous spirits already saw us in Italy and occupying Venice, but taking it all round, it would not have been a hopeful sign if it had been found necessary once again to stuff the ribs of the Austrian skeleton with German divisions, all on account of the surrender of 12,000 Austrians. So we turned first to the east, but then decidedly to the south, and ended our journey in the valley of the Meuse, still far away from the front. For the time being, it is being given out that the offensive will not come off for some time. Meanwhile, the horses are forgetting how to eat oats, because there are none available, which seems to me significant. The country is beautiful. The many windings of the river, the wooded heights with their chateaux, which are sensible and not too wildly romantic in appearance, the glorious meadows down beside the stream, in which one first cheerfully breaks into a gallop, then soon drops back ruefully into a walk at the thought of one's hungry mount. All these are calculated to make one feel appreciative, to stand still and admire. Hurrying on from one fresh point to another, one follows the valley now in its bottom, now on the hills above, and feels in a mood to enjoy life in quite an aimless way. Then all of a sudden everything seems out of tune, and one rides home discontented, unwilling to believe that it is all true, for fear of seeming to ask too much of life. Charleville, June 29th, 1918. Since yesterday the horses of the division have had no oats. It depresses me. Among other things, I am responsible for seeing that the draft horses are serviceable. To keep up the fiction of a hard ration, they are now offered 2 pounds of dried chopped turnips. All other nourishment they are supposed to get from grazing, and that is to go on until the day of the offensive, as if one could suddenly stoke up a horse's body like a boiler. The shortage of horses is bad enough, but the shortage of fodder. I heard a few interesting details on that matter yesterday from the veterinary inspector of the Quartermaster General. The Entente has 4.5 million horses at the front, while we have only 1.5. They have all the horses in the world, and more or less all the fodder at their disposal. All the help that we can get, after every sort of urgent request, is a miserably 5,000 horses from Austria. Where the fodder is to come from, nobody yet knows. The Entente uses up 45,000 monthly. Our consumption is correspondingly less, but at the same time about as much in proportion, namely 1/3. When we advance, we are to leave all our baggage behind. All very well, that can be endured. But we shall also have to leave guns behind, ammunition wagons, and so on. This will reduce our artillery strength by about 1/4. It would not be safe to let the infantry know that. All the same, everybody hopes for the best. I should do so too if I did not see these flaws in the reckoning. 3 gun batteries, reduced ammunition quota, and horses without oats in their bellies to haul these guns. It is a different tale from 4 gun batteries, unlimited ammunition, and teams of 6 horses bursting with oats. That was what used to be considered the right allowance. And now 4 Ukrainian blindworms with grass in their bellies are to do the same work. No more riding either for the likes of us. No one will find his fortune in that any more. The only horses in this town which show any decent coat and muscle are the race horses of the German Crown Prince. I do not say that the oats of which they deprive other horses would win the war. All the same, there is no need to have 12 thoroughbreds, as sleek as eels and bursting with oats, running around under fine woolen blankets, with smart grooms in uniform, while an artillery horse gets a ration of 2 pounds of chopped turnip a day. The unnecessary thick black dust scattered by the Crown Prince's cars as they tear about the town, almost always empty and to no apparent purpose, is unfortunately not thick enough to cover up all that goes on at these headquarters, and shoves itself offensively under our noses. I ask myself why I am ashamed that at a time when everything is at stake, the Crown Prince should keep a monkey. Yes, a real big monkey, which sits on a chair in the riding school and screams out its demands at the section of cavalry NCOs when it gets bored. Then everybody laughs. I ask why I am ashamed and not the Crown Prince. Charleville, July 1st, 1918. In order to prevent peacetime memories from growing dim, we had a parade of all the infantry of the division before the German Crown Prince imposed upon us, and that set a whole lot of people in a greater state of excitement than much more important things. The presenting of arms looked like the movements of a centipede, while the march past reminded one of the trickling of a winding brook through a green meadow. The weather was fine, and the whole business was delightfully ridiculous and absurd, since there was nothing to be made of it as a spectacle either of war or of peace. The Crown Prince was in good form, and apparently made a good impression on the men. They could not see the big flashy rings on his fingers, and such things do not mean anything to them. He has got an easy, affable way with him, and no sign of embarrassment. He appears deliberately to cultivate this talent for getting on with people. 231. On closer attention, one notices and misses all sorts of things. His friend Z is certainly a damned nice fellow, who makes himself responsible for decent horses, if not for other decencies. It ought, however, to have been possible for him to get the Crown Prince to combine with that some feeling and inclination for higher values, but I shall never forget that fellow's words. He is one of the very straightest and best, and he probably carries a desire deep in his heart which he has sacrificed along with himself to his friendship. Sadly, he confessed, "I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm a little better than a court jester." Among those in attendance on the Crown Prince, there was an Oberpräsident von M., who made a good impression, and who is reported by the military household to be a coming man. But it is easy to excel where practically the only distinctions are medals. It is almost sufficient to be in the train of the Crown Prince to count as a coming man. All in all, the designation is simply degrading and illusory. There was not a cloud in the sky for yesterday's play, but the storm in the world is slowly gathering. Here and there, every now and then, down comes a cloud which hides armed men behind it, piles itself up with others in the night, and then lies still until one day it will burst with other clouds in a hurricane. Everywhere the atmosphere is close, charged, electric. One can see more or less the direction which the piles of clouds are taking. Very slowly in the darkness they draw near to other piles, and watch carefully that nothing shall disturb the calm, that not a breath shall stir, nor a shot be fired. This may last for a long time. Anyway, we are ready. Everything that is possible we have done. The quarters are becoming worse and worse. We shall end up again soon in mud and trenches. Champagne, July 10th, 1918. We are still far away from the point of the front at which we are to attack. We are slowly feeling our way. We know now that we are not to run behind after others, but to go first. At the moment we are sitting in a wood full of strawberries. I have never seen so many strawberries together as there are hereabout. They are the very small kind, smelling and tasting like sweet earth. The camp stands among weedy birch and pine trees, or rather its little blockhouses are half let into the earth, so as to make them invisible to airmen and not easy to see from the level. You do not notice the roof and the entrance hole until you are right on top of them. We are now breathing the everlasting dust which the war throws up over this chalky country. Right into the great open woods, the foliage is as white as if it had been powdered with lime. At night a cloud of dust hangs over the roads, and pours to right and left into the woods and fields. Even in the morning it still shows what the darkness of the night covered. The barrenness of this country and its poverty in water can be felt every day and every hour. The horses will not touch the miserable dusty grass. Every morning and evening they go an hour's journey away under cover of darkness to the river to drink. It is true there is a well, but at the well there is a man posted who demands written authority for every bucket of water which he draws. And we are to win in the face of such difficulties as these, which certainly do not exist on the enemy's side. July 12, 1918. If we can reach the sea before the Americans can reach the land, we shall have struck the decisive blow. To capture Paris itself would not be sufficient. The atmosphere about us remains charged. It is as if the tension in each one of us could not be high enough. Nevertheless, I do not count on either England or America giving up the war. They have no need to. It is silly to calculate otherwise, and to build hopes on the U-boats, on a victory over the English army in France, or anything else. All that cannot help towards a conclusion with those two. Champagne, July 14th, 1918. Tonight is the fateful one. It looks as if the enemy suspected nothing, but that is hardly credible. The dust clouds over the roads, which mark the path of the troops and transport even in the morning, would alone be sufficient to give us away. We move late in the evening, and between 1 and 2 o'clock hell breaks loose. The preparations for this hell consisted mainly of paper. The road to it was paved with paper. If we fire off as much ammunition at the enemy as we had paper fired at us, he will have a bad time. As all the preparations were made in slow time, the horses and transport trains have stood the marches fairly well, although they had no oats. The heavy guns were in position. Wherever there was a hitch, horses were lent and borrowed. My own prospects for tomorrow are bad and full of responsibility. I am being used as a liaison officer with the division on our flank. Generally speaking, this means that one gets badly treated, so far as one will stand it, and has to put up with being ridden over roughshod. One gets shoved anywhere because one does not belong to the division and has to shift for oneself. Bivouac among brushwood, July 16th, 1918. I have lived through the most disheartening day of the whole war, though it was by no means the most dangerous. This wilderness of chalk is not very big, but it seems endless when one gets held up in it, and we are held up. Under a merciless sun, which set the air quivering in a dance of heat, and sent wave after hot wave up from the grilling soil, the treeless, waterless chalk downs lay devoid of all colour, like stones at white heat. No shade, no paths, not even roads, just crumbling white streaks on a flat plate. Across this wind, rusty snakes of barbed wire. Into this the French deliberately lured us. They put up no resistance in front. They had neither infantry or artillery in this forward battle zone, the full use and value of which they had learned from Ludendorff. Our guns bombarded empty trenches. Our gas shells gassed empty artillery positions. Only in little hidden folds of the ground, sparsely distributed, lay machine gun posts, like lice in the seams and folds of a garment, to give the attacking force a warm reception. The barrage, which was to have preceded and protected it, went right on somewhere over the enemy's rear positions, while in front the first real line of resistance was not yet carried. After uninterrupted fighting from 5 o'clock in the morning until the night, smothered all the time with carefully directed fire, we only succeeded in advancing about 3 kilometres in the direction of the high-lying Roman road, which traverses the whole fighting front like a crossbeam. The staff of our left flanking division, to which I was attached for the day, had not expected resistance, and moved forward close behind the attacking troops. After riding and wandering between endless barbed wire entanglements, being hung up and having to walk round mountains of chalk rubble, I found it with great difficulty posted in a chalk trench which, like everything else, was easily visible with an ordinary telescope from the Roman road. The use of the position as the command post of an important headquarters was made still more evident by the runners and officers approaching it, but in order to save no trouble to make it as dangerous as possible, they had gone to the length of putting up a heliograph station on the very edge of the trench. From it there flashed without ceasing brilliant helio signals more powerful than the sun, intended for our artillery. Not content with this, the signal apparatus, which was served by infantry soldiers, was set up, so to speak, like a target, for immediately behind the dark figures and their tripod was a white hill of chalk thrown up from the trench and exposed to the full glare of the sun. The result of this performance was that in less than half an hour, the enemy had found the range with his guns and was putting shells nearer and nearer. A few minutes later, there was a direct hit full into the trench. I saw what was coming. I drew the attention of the GOC division, von R, to the absurd exposure of the position. I was actually standing beside him and had just stepped back to make room for one of his officers when a shell burst between the two of them. Both were badly wounded. The ADC bled to death in a few minutes. He had saved my life. I was simply mad. How could one be expected to put one's heart into such a business? There was no courage to behave as these people did. At the most, it could amuse a few irresponsible people who were prepared to gamble with their own and other people's lives. But there was worse to follow. All the telephone wires were cut, shot to pieces, or broken by our own guns and transport. Consequently, the division received no reports from the front. Instead of sending out a lieutenant or two, the GOC division himself must be seized with a fit of impatience and false courage and go off on foot, taking the GSO. One with him. They ran about like that for hours, unattainable by anybody. No orders could be carried out, and none was given. Fiercer and fiercer grew the inquiries after the responsible officers. All inquiries and all reports had to be sent elsewhere at hazard. One could feel the panic of troops deserted by their commanders gradually growing. When eventually the officers returned from their tour, on which they had been started by a false appreciation of the situation, they were so tired out that they were of no use for the rest of the day. They never realized what they had done and what risks they had run. Meanwhile, in the whole area in which we were kept confined by the enemy's fire and our own helplessness, neither man nor beast had had anything to eat or drink. When at the end of the day I tried to find my own division again, I found myself leading my horse by the bridle with my eyes on the ground, dead beat and half asleep. The achievements of all the other divisions in this sector were on the same scale. We did not see a single dead Frenchman, let alone a captured gun or machine gun, and we had suffered heavy losses. On one of the chalk hills I saw an artillery ammunition column which had all its horses killed. What it was doing up there nobody knows, for not even the guns had got so far. The drivers hadn't had the sense to turn around when they found they had come too far. They just stood there in view of the enemy, as if they were bewitched or spellbound, until the damage was done. Everything seemed to go wrong. My own work was useless. None of my reports had reached the GSO. One of the division. I found our HQ again in the evening, thanks to a marvellous instinct for direction combined with pure chance. I walked beside my horse, wondering whether there was any remedy for human folly, and came to the conclusion that there would be none so long as the human race lasted. Late in the evening, friend and foe alike were so exhausted that they left one another alone. I lay down in the mud under Luttich's belly. My face was burning as if it had been sprinkled with pepper. At last, late at night, the ration card arrived. I got my servant to pull me out a bottle of wine and drank it at one draught where I lay, although I did my best to go slow. My body sucked up the moisture so greedily that I felt heavy in every limb. I spent the night in that uncertain sort of drowse which so often takes me. All the others slept like logs. July 17th, 1918. I spent the night before last in a dugout 28 steps down below the earth, where I was half devoured by the fleas, which are all over the place here. So last night I brought what remained of my body up to the surface. To look up into the slowly darkling sky excites rather than calms the nerves. For a long time I lay awake. The shells dread their weirdness over my head. When I saw their flash, I knew when to expect the report. Then they began to search for the batteries behind the little wood in which I had made my bed, and crashed with a wild roar. But so long as they were in the air, it was really a pleasure to listen. Eventually I went off to sleep without realizing why. High-pitched sounds in the air are as good a lullaby as a lark's song. The sun in this part of the country sucks even more out of us than the vermin. Every now and then, to prove to oneself that one's tongue has not stuck to one's gums, one spits out a little spittle, which looks like little wads of cotton wool. The one and only well has been pumped dry. July 19th, 1918. Since our experiences of July 16th, I know that we are finished. My thoughts oppress me. How are we to recover ourselves? Kultur, as it will be known after the war, will be of no use. Mankind itself will probably be of still less use. We must get away from ourselves, away from folly, away from delusion, from stupidity, shallowness, lower pleasures, and from the commonplace. To the west of Reims, July 25th, 1918. The confusion and blunders are increasing. We are now looking at Reims from the west. The country is more attractive, an upland rising to fairly considerable heights, with woods, valleys, and deserted vineyards. We have been spending uncomfortable days in crowded, ruined villages, in which we were thrown hither and thither without plan, disturbed day and night by bombardment and bombing from somewhere or other. Today, everything seems to be at a standstill. I do not believe that we shall ever get our hands free again. The American army is there, 1 million strong. That is too much. Same date. The last movement of HQ I rode on horseback, since it is no pleasure to drive in a car on these roads. I passed through the region to the north of Reims. It evokes nothing but a strange new horror. In this soil, from which one flees if one has any feeling, men have been cooped up for years, fighting for it with their lifeblood, as if it were some unheard-of treasure, and now it extends parched, barren and dreary in the sun and dust, like a scene from hell, by which one has to pass because there is no other way. One meets no human being for hours together. The horses lasted the distance well. At last we came upon water here in a canal. Luttich was picketed in an unknown field of oats, where he ate his belly full. July 27th, 1918. Although worse things happen every day in this war than the ruin of already damaged villages, such things, nevertheless, make one sick at heart. This afternoon, the pretty little town, which we were abandoning in our retreat, and which we were practically the last unit to leave, was turned over to be looted almost as if by previous arrangement. In the twinkling of an eye, everything was turned upside down, as if the looters were professionals. Nothing was really turned to any use. The soldiers hacked whole beds to pieces for the sake of a length of sheeting the size of a towel, and worth about 1/50th of their value. Thousands of sheets of paper were thrown into the mud for the sake of a single picture postcard, and whole cupboards burst open for the sake of a reel of cotton. The safes, which of course were empty, were peppered with bullets in the hope of breaking them open. There was not very much to be had, but in the end nearly everything was carried off. You could see men with 4 sunshades under their arms, others carrying a dozen plates. It is certain that in both cases the loot will be lying smashed in the mud by tonight. July 30th, 1918. Owing to our inability to defend ourselves, the attacks from the air are becoming a great plague for the slowly retreating troops, even for HQ itself. At midday yesterday, 30 big aeroplanes, nicely escorted by enemy fighting planes, and nicely left alone by the German airmen, gave us a regular hail of bombs. The poor horses suffered particularly heavily, since they can neither throw themselves flat nor climb trees. The whistling of the falling bombs was like the noise of 1,000 door keys used to hiss a bad play. The explosions followed by hundreds so rapidly that it sounded as if it were hailing red-hot iron bars of 50 pounds. Weight each. On explosion they burst into millions of splinters, which flew out horizontally and caused hundreds of casualties. At night the airmen illuminate the spot where their heavy bombs are to be dropped by means of magnesium parachutes, which light up the place for 5 minutes at a time. The roof tiles rattle, and at every explosion the whole house in which I lie gives a bang as if it had jumped several inches into the air. As it is no safer in the cellar than anywhere else, I lie in my camp bed and read your letters which came yesterday once again. Mankind has always made war on one another for something silly. In the Trojan War it was for a slut of a woman. In other wars it was because one god was supposed to be better than another. In the Middle Ages the manhood of the West went to its death for the sake of an empty tomb which the Turks possessed. And now the whole world of our enemies pretends that they have got to liberate us. From what and from whom? July 31st, 1918. since the flight into the cellars caused by the bombardment of the night before last, during which Big R, Our Excellency, and myself are said to have been the only ones who stayed upstairs, it was decided last night to evacuate Jonchery, which in other respects is a nice place. Now we have found an ample resting place on a hillside overlooking Reims, in a simply magnificent airy dugout, which some English HQ had built for it. The exits and living rooms face the wrong way, that is, in the direction of the enemy's guns, but the whole place is covered over and rendered invisible by a wonderful net, into which bits of rag and foliage have been woven. If they do shoot, one can disappear almost into the bowels of the earth. There is one room above another, with the real refuge right at the bottom. The dusty ruins of Hermanville lie in the valley below us, and far behind them the Cathedral of Reims gleaming white in the midday sun. Our regiments are slowly retiring onto the new line. August 4th, 1918. The troops have now been entirely withdrawn from the sector which we have just left. It was evacuated almost without loss. The enemy who followed on our heels had none either. I have a bad opinion of the situation, but when I express it I find that people shut their minds rather than their ears to what I say. The German officer cannot realize that things are as they are. Here are the indications. Everybody is tired of the war. One hears men say, "Why not give them this by Alsace-Lorraine?" Their manhood has been sapped in such a way that there is no stiffening it. Our division is one of the few possible exceptions. Carelessness and callousness are spreading like plagues. One feels that the year from which for the first time one seriously hoped for a decision, because there was no holding out any longer, has been simply thrown away. At home they are impotent. The brains of all the great men who signed the manifesto of the League of Loyalty represent altogether no more than the brain of an eloquent idiot. And then there is the endless self-delusion. Certainly the same thing may be seen with the enemy, but that does not make things any better for the human race or for ourselves. One keeps on repeating that there is no sense in using oneself up. One repeats, too, that one is not there to go on being used up in this never-ending folly, whether one rots in a damp dugout or whether one lies dry. I have no more to do with the theory that one is bound to go on sharing in the folly of the human race because one belongs to it. I do not feel that I am to blame because mankind behaves as it does. It is its fault, not mine. Here is the stupidest war of positions starting afresh. It is necessary because it is forced upon us, and from the military point of view it may yet prove justified. In the end it may lead to something which can be called peace. But I am not convinced that it is reasonable for me personally, and therefore I feel it is unreasonable for me to go on. Chalons-le-Verger, August 12th, 1918. I have been having extraordinary attacks of fever, with such general neuralgia that I can only manage to exist in an artificial condition of tottering weakness with the help of aspirin and pyramidon. This was followed by a nasty attack of champagne fever, something like typhoid, with ghastly symptoms of intestinal poisoning which laid me out. I'm simply collapsing. Even so, we all have to eat bread that is as damp as a bath sponge. The cooking is done with a so-called butter, which is as old and rancid as war fever, and to finish up with, we dig green potatoes out of the fields, not new potatoes, but green October roots. So once you have got it, this diet makes it certain that you will not get rid of it. On top of that, there is insomnia. The enemy appears to shoot all day and all night long. Today they were considerate enough to fire practically nothing except duds over our queue heads into a swamp, hundreds of them in the same place. But even if they do not bang, they moan all the way until their end, and one is never sure that some shell will not sideslip and smash up our poor huts or bodies. Even so, one is so insensible that one waits for them to hit one on the head before moving out of the way. We have acquired the philosophy of a louse, to sit tight as long as possible. August 12th, evening. A lot of officers and men have just gone on leave and thought that they had earned it. And here we are being hauled out again to be shoved in just where it is warmest. I shudder to think of going through the Somme wilderness for the 4th time. It will be the same all over again, but without any confidence. Our troops will be thinner and worse. For days the horses have not had a grain of oats. The men are being given barley bread which will not rise in the oven, and we have taken some knocks. Against us we shall have thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of airmen, hundreds of thousands of hearty young men, behind whom there will be an American army which may number 1,000,000. I can see and feel mysterious powers rising out of the deep which are not governed by any man's brain, but by uncontrollable movements and forces. Perhaps it is the privilege of helpless humanity to save itself in this way. Perhaps not we, but others will go down. Last night I dreamed I saw the Kaiser entering what seemed to be the gateway of a camp, bareheaded and on foot, forced by his people to give himself up to their mercy. I don't know whether he ended up on the scaffold, but I should not be surprised. There are some things I do not want to go through again, not because I am afraid of them, but because I have seen them before and do not want to experience them twice. I have seen too much these last days' signs and tokens. In the end, even if an individual nation does not get its deserts, humanity will. This generation has no future and deserves none. Anyone who belongs to it lives no more. It is almost a consolation to realize this. All that an individual can do to get out of the rack is to find some way of hewing out blocks of stone, wherewith to found a new structure which to this generation will be nothing, and leave it as a legacy to others. August 17th, 1918. I am in the grip of a fever. Some days I am quite free. Then again a weakness overcomes me so that I can barely drag myself in a cold perspiration onto my bed and blankets. Then pain, so that I don't know whether I am alive or dead. I can neither eat nor drink, and yet have constantly a bitter taste in my mouth from thirst. My bowels suddenly revolt as though I were poisoned, then subside again, but the weakness lasts. So it has been going on for weeks. August 19th, 1918. We were moved eastwards and sent into the line again, not at a warm spot after all, at least so far as we can see at present. Still, the only rest the troops have had has been hardship. The quarters were nothing but tents and shelters, holes in the earth and bare boards. Lice and fleas exhaust us, and the nearest delousing plant is out of reach on the other side of the wilderness round Rheims. The little light railways are no help. In addition to that, the rations are getting worse. No potatoes, bread made almost exclusively of barley meal, and in short quantity. Last but not least, the local fever. Personally, I have been sick since August 1st, and am as limp as a rag. All the same, I do not want to chuck up just now. Although there is nothing much to do at present, I have never felt so ill since the beginning of the war. As often as I get the chance, I collapse onto the folding bed, which I fortunately had brought away from the chateau at Beaucourt, where the French are now again, but I can never get enough rest. Camp on the Ain Canal, August 21st, 1918. A day or two ago I went for a walk with Big R on a little island which lies opposite our camp in a branch of the Ain. I said to him, if anybody wanted to make a good but light-hearted bet, he would lay odds that the Hohenzollerns will have to abdicate. The big fellow shrugged his shoulders. Maybe right, he said dryly. August 25th, 1918. 6 hours of shivering, a temperature of 102 degrees, then hours of perspiration till I was so weak that I could not move a limb without help, and all my nerves were in commotion. My pulse was racing at 120 to the minute, and I was talking nonsense. One really gets fed up with oneself. In these circumstances, the divisional MO insists that I must get away from here as soon as possible. I have got to go to a hospital from which I need not be moved. Reserve Hospital, Baden-Baden, September 24th, 1918. I have been through a bad go of dysentery. Baden-Baden, November 11th, 1918. The news from the front about the retreat of my division and the army was hard to bear. Read side by side with the communiques of the Supreme Command, they did not agree. What transformations events do go through from the moment they happen until they appear in the form of the daily bulletin. The reports of my comrades from the front and during the retreat are scanty, and I suppose this is not yet the time to publish them. I must say that I can watch this disintegration of the army almost without feeling upset. I had already gone through it all in mind. When it happened, one hardly felt it. All sorts of changes have taken place in the world during the last 2 days. A curious revolution. So far as the movement in Germany is concerned, what surprises me, in spite of the constant talk of violent convulsions, is its superficiality. In the same way, when the sea sends big waves to the shore, we imagine that it is disturbed to its depths, but as a matter of fact it is quite calm down below. All the foam and the momentary violence are merely on the surface. If the workmen's and soldiers' councils imagine that they have given the people the freedom which they want, they are much mistaken. This movement will soon show itself to be the most one-sided regime imaginable and reduce itself ad absurdum, after which it will probably give way to some stronger government. If the present governments do any good, so much the better. For the time being, the workmen's and soldiers' councils at least achieve this much. Thanks to a sort of delusion by which they imagine themselves to be immortal, they prevent the mob from breaking out in violence. To that I have no objection, but I find all their acts, even their demands, so absurdly superficial, so half-boiled, that I cannot conceive any sort of stability in this form. I admit that inwardly I cannot feel any great pity for a people which plays politics with the most serious face in the world, at a time when it ought to be reforming itself to its depths. From my sickbed I can hear the people in the street. The same fellows who marched through the town 2 nights ago enthusiastically singing the Wacht am Rhein were singing today a new tune which has been produced for the occasion. We're going behind the Rhine line, the Rhine line, the Rhine line. It is the same in everything. I won't prophesy that tomorrow they will be cheering their banished Grand Duke, but yesterday they were singing the Wacht am Rhein, and today they're going behind the Rhine line, the Rhine line. What one sees in the hospital here is very characteristic. The one appreciable result of the soldiers' councils is that today we had no sweet for dinner. I am quite overcome. Is that resurrection? Is that a revolution? At home, November 14th, 1918. My journey home was made through the middle of teeming masses of men in field grey, who had poured over here from Alsace, either deserters from the front or men who had been hanging around behind it for some time, had to get into the train through the window and out again the same way. I realise that I am not yet quite up to the gymnastic efforts and performances of my youth. I reached my house after midnight with what I should imagine were the last means of conveyance possible.